topic for today is stereo breaks, and I wanted to give a shout out to the subscriber Lizard Horse, who gave a comment to say about stereo breaks, and they were the catalyst for this video and the suggestions. So thank you very much. And if you have any suggestions, please let me know in the comments. I'll try and check those out. Goals for this video today are: 1, talk about mono and stereo, dig into a little bit about amplitude, phase and polarity and frequency, and speak about that a little bit. 2, I wanted to try out some of Bob Macc's recommendations from his blog about fixing stereo breaks, and maybe give you some of my own techniques as well. So if there's 2 things I love, it's geeky chat and break beats. But before we get into that, we need to explore mono and stereo just to make sure we know exactly what those are, and we'll get into it really. So mono is short for monophonic, and what that really means is just one thing. So it could be one signal, and so if you have exactly the same in the left and the right, even though it's got a left and a right, that's still mono information. One way we can describe mono as well is that there are no differences between the left and the right in a stereo environment. Mono is really good when you want things to sound powerful. If both speakers are working together, this speaker and this speaker, or you've got a stereo system and both your speakers are pushing simultaneously, then we're going to have a stronger overall result. So that's really what I'm trying to say, is mono gives you really powerful signals, and that's why we like mono. We totally want stereo information. Of course we do. We want stereo width because that gives us a sense of the sound stage. It gives us a sense of depth. We need stereo information. People talk about making sure your low end is a little bit more controlled and a little bit more mono and play back properly without loads of issues. So that's definitely something that comes up in this conversation as well. But if you can toggle in that mono and toggle back to stereo, mono, stereo, and you're like, okay, I'm not too worried about the amount of information that I'm losing there. It's kind of acceptable. It still translates my idea. Everything's still cool. You've got pretty acceptable mono compatibility at that point. And once that's the case, you're good to go with your tune really. What I wanted to give you an example of here before we move on is just speak a little bit about polarity and phase. This here is a bass sample and it's completely mono. I just play you a little example of it. Now it looks like my meters up on this screen aren't doing anything. We've just got a single line here to show it's completely mono. We've got a tiny little white dot here to show it's completely mono. We've got all this being blue. We've got nothing happening here, nothing happening here, and nothing happening here to show you this sound is truly mono. So I just wanted to talk about polarity for a second. If I just quickly duplicate this sound and I just phase flip this one sound here, it's completely phased reversed. And if I press play now, despite there being 2 signals, what we have is silence. You can see here that because of polarity, while one waveform is trying to push the speaker forward, the other waveform at exactly the same time and exactly the same amount is trying to push the speaker back. And that is a problem, because if you put those 2 sounds together, you'll get complete silence. But what's interesting is if you pan that hard left, one of them, and the other one hard right, you'll get the most stereo signal possible, where we have the whole line going from blue down to yellow, showing you all of that signal is out of phase. We can also see this meter here going across to show you this is a completely out of phase signal. When we pan hard left and hard right with that information, the widest we can possibly get is 2 signals out of phase, hard left and hard right. The second example that I wanted to give you, quick recap of phase. So polarity is where we flip it, change it in terms of the positive and the negative, but the phase and the polarity are closely linked, 180 degrees out of phase, but it doesn't have to be 180 degrees. You can just move things a tiny bit along so that these waveforms, for instance, start a little bit at different times. So you can see this one starts a bit later, and these are going to boost and interact in different ways. So we've still got a completely mono signal, but you can hear the change a little bit. Slightly strange sound. If I put it back to normal and with a bit of phase, you can hear we've kind of got that flangey, phasey sort of sound. And once again, if I pan these hard left and hard right now, got some stereo image. Another thing that we can do for stereo width, for example, and I can just put one left and one right, but I can just turn this one down a bit. And now this meter and this one here all think that the signal is coming from the left. And that's because it's louder on the left hand side and quieter on the right hand side. So they're all different ways that we can make things stereo. Check out mattchapmanaudio.com for mixing and mastering, one-to-one music production blogs, and exclusive content in the store. That's mattchapmanaudio.com. So I just wanted to recap that and be really clear that the three main things we have to make things stereo. So the first way is by amplitude. So if one signal is louder in our left ear, we'll perceive it coming from the left. The second is to do with time. If we hear that the signals are coming to us at different times, the left signal hits my ear first and the right signal it hits later, we call that the Haas effect, where we just move one of the sides a little bit later and suddenly we have stereo width. And you can mix and match those things. So you can delay a signal and turn it down a little bit for exploring a little bit more about stereo. Next up, after that, we've got frequency. So say for instance, if I put these back to normal, so both back on time, both at the same volume, and they're just left and right, but I do a bit of EQ on one of these basses. So I'm just going to do a bit of EQ. We can see it here. So frequency can also be a factor in giving us a stereo width as well. Outside our head, we've got the bit of ear on the outside, which is called the pinna. And if frequencies have to go through the actual outer bit of the ear before they go into the ear canal, they might be filtered in some type of way. And if sounds have to go through our head before they reach this ear, they're going to sound in another way again. And because of that, our ears are fine-tuned to those frequency differences. And that also gives us an impression of stereo. The positive of stereo is that it can give us lots of information. It can give us a sense of space, the depth of the ensemble, and the size of a room can also be kind of communicated with stereo image as well. But as anything with audio, we normally want a balance. We want the impressiveness and the perception of immersion from stereo, but we also want some of the power of mono. And trading off those two things is a decision that you'll need to make. And I'd love to know what you aim for with stereo width. Are you all about making things sound really natural, or do you want a little bit of hyper real where it's a little bit bigger and wider, or do you just want things to be as massive as they possibly can? And I'd love to know what your approach is. You know, do you even care about mono-compatibility? What about the Beatles, where they just put the whole bass part on the left and the whole drum part on the right? What does that mean? So I'd love to know your thoughts about that. But now that we've seen with making differences to make things wider, then we can also think about how can we make stereo breaks that are all rattly and kind of like crunchy narrower so that they're more mono-compatible. And that's something that I wanted to talk about. So I wanted to give a moment to shout out to Bob Macc. I definitely read his blog on processing stereo break beats and dealing with them before I started this video. I'll put a link in the description below so that you can check that out. The problem that we're facing and the thing that we're trying to talk about here is we've found an old crusty break beat that we like and it sounds good in stereo, but when we put it to mono, things go wrong. What we're actually dealing with when we have a stereo break is lots more complexity and a lot more unknowns. So we'll have multiple drum mics that have spill from the other microphones coming into them, which creates phasey sort of things. Unknown panning and processing, room mics, overheads, and then we might have extra reverbs and delays added in the mixdown as well. All of that information has been crammed down to a stereo file, which we sampled. So we can't just do one of those simple basic techniques and hope it'll be all fixed. What we need to do is more subtle, more delicate, and really think about what problem we're trying to solve and what our goal is. So the problem that we're trying to solve is that when we put a crusty old break into mono, we want the result to be acceptable. We don't want to press mono and it just completely disappears or stuff gets really lost or whatever. We want to click mono and be like, okay, it's kind of on the same ballpark. And then we click mono off and we're like, yeah, that still sounds good. So it sounds acceptable in both the ones. Because if you process it too far, you'll lose the stereo character. If you don't process it enough, you don't have mono-compatibility. So once again, it's a balance that you want to think about. What I'd like to do now is show you a few techniques that you can try for fixing stereo breaks. So we've got this break here. I'll just play it on its own. And I actually think it sounds pretty great already. But the problem is when I put this break into mono, I noticed my top end. So if I put this into mono, so if you listen particularly to the rides, ping, 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 like that on the ride, stereo, we get a whole bunch of that beautiful ride coming through. But when I put it into mono, I don't get that same cool information. And we can actually see it on these meters here. You can see that the most of the break at the bottom here is in phase most of the time. But when we get to the top, we can see this stuff around 8K is all out of phase. What we can think about here is how can we try and solve this with EQ. So the first thing we can do is look up here. There's some information which I think is the ride. So I think the ride bell is around 3K. There's a bit which goes left on 3K. So what I want to do is bring out a little bit of the right hand side on this one. And now when I press mono, that ride symbol is not completely lost when I go to mono. So this is just one example of what we can do, and you can add a lot more to your EQ if you wanted to. And that's kind of done the job that I wanted. The rides come through when I play it in mono and the break's not ruined either way. I could go in and add loads of these and try and fix every bit, but you've got to remember with audio, this stuff is delicate. So if I start doing that, I'm going to be ruining a whole bunch of stuff that I don't need to. So that was one example of how you might fix a break. I wanted to give you a second example of how I might go about it, and this is where you might think about it more in terms of just flipping the phase on one tiny little area. I'll show you an example of that. I can put an EQ node in here and an all pass. Now what an all pass filter does, it'll allow you to delay slightly a frequency, so all the frequencies around this area can get delayed, and I can use that just on maybe the left hand side for instance, or the right hand side or whatever, to help fix out some of the phase. So this one, I've got to be honest, I wouldn't truly recommend it unless you really needed it, because you know when you start messing with this stuff, you bring out a whole bunch of other mad problems as well. So if you don't know what you're doing and be like, I saw on Matt's video he said mess about with all pass filters, and you mess everything up, that's no good. But check this out on this particular example just to show you what it can do. So the track is in mono now, and I'll bypass this EQ in and out. And you can hear that the ride bell has come forward and it's kind of sitting much better in with the track now. And that's because I've delayed some signals just on the left hand side and just around these frequencies. This is maybe too much, but I want to say really clearly, don't be a fool and go messing up all your sound because Matt told you about all pass filters. That's like a rare occasion where I would do that. But it's a cool tip to know about if you're like really stuck, you've tried everything else, you've tried gentle, just left and right EQ, and you want something else, and that's just one thing that you could maybe consider. And this is a final break. I would say the final boss of breaks is almost completely stereo. If I go in and play you the mono, we can see we get really different results between the mono and stereo. One way that I might go about fixing this break is with this cool plugin called Dr. MS. And this is an example of when you only have stereo information. So there isn't really much mono information there. So this one control here, depth, what it can do is it can grab some sides information and push it back into the mono in a really robust way. So let's try that out. So here's mono. we've got less differences. And so this might be a bit of a heavy hitter for fixing that particular problem, but that's one way that I've found that you can add some sides back into the mono if it's just sides information and you want to get it back locked in for the break. So I don't know whether people would agree with me on that one, or whether that's one like to just use in extreme circumstances, but that was the info that I wanted to give you today. I hope that helped with fixing stereo breaks, and shout out to Lizard Horse. And if you've got any other suggestions yourself, let me know, drop me a comment. Shout out to Bob Macc for his blog post. I hope I've done him justice, and if I've messed anything up or not been clear, it's my fault, it's not Bob's. If you don't know of any other techniques for fixing old stereo breaks that you might try, and you want to get in on a discussion about the complexity of this and how to get it just right, feel free to share your ideas in the comments. I'd love to know. But that's it for today. Until next time, nice one.